When John Quincy Adams became president in 1825, those were the worst 4 years of his life. It's important to know a few things about John Quincy Adams to understand his presidency and understand, because he will be one of the leaders of the National Republicans and then the Whigs later. So it's really important to understand him. He was acutely aware, he's the only president who did not win in either the popular vote or the Electoral College. Remember, the election of 1824 was decided in the House of Representatives, so he came in as a minority president and he knew it. That was really bad for him because he also had some other flaws. He was not attractive, and that's not a flaw, but he just was well aware of that. And he had no charisma. He was constantly dour. He was very brooding. He was chronically depressed. He was a lot like his father. Hated everyone, especially himself. And this is really important. The reason he was so hard to be around and had no charisma is he is widely considered by most historians. They've done surveys of the best historians, and it's very widely agreed he is the most brilliant president we have ever had. His IQ was somewhere in the neighborhood of 170. Obviously, we didn't have IQ tests back then, but by a lot of measures, he is one of the most brilliant presidents we've ever had. He was a level of intelligence that he was so far out of his time. And if you've ever met someone who has an IQ of 150 or way up there, they're just awkward people. They think differently. So, they're in that percentage of the population that they don't know how to relate to everyone else. That's John Quincy Adams. That's why he was so awkward. He spoke 7 languages. 3 times a day he would read his Bible, once in English, once in German, once in French. He also knew Greek and Latin fluently. He was absolutely brilliant, and he was one of the most qualified people to ever be president. He started his service to the United States as a diplomat when he was 10 years old. During the American Revolution, his dad, John Adams, was going to England to be the diplomat, and John Quincy Adams, 10 years old, went with him. So they're sailing across the Atlantic to become be diplomats. And I said they went to England. They were going to France, and they were being chased by British ships. So John Adams and John Quincy Adams, their lives were at stake. He's 10 years old. His mother told him before he left to go on this voyage where he might die, do not bring disrespect and dishonor to your family. No, be safe, nothing like that. His dad told him, if you don't reach the highest levels of political office and serve your country, then you have wasted all the talents and time that has been put into you. So he had a ton of pressure, and he lived up to those expectations. He was a diplomat and ambassador all over the world. So he started in France. He will eventually be all over the world, including England, later Belgium, France, Denmark, Holland, Russia. So he went all over the world and served as a diplomat. He also served in the Massachusetts state legislature as a senator. He will serve in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And he is considered the best Secretary of State in all of U.S. history. So he was insanely brilliant and insanely qualified. But the 4 years as president will be the least happy 4 years of his life. He had grand ambitions for what he wanted to do. He wanted to do all sorts of things to progress the United States and move it forward. So his basic idea was to use the government to advance society. And before people, when they hear that, they think, I'm for that or against that based on their political ideology. Let me tell you what he was talking about. He wanted to have an observatory. Europe had a bunch of observatories, and he thought the United States needed to progress in terms of science. He wanted to create internal improvements, roads and canals, and so the United States could have better transportation systems, so we could have more trade. He wanted to go have the metric system. Today, the United States is like the only country in the world that doesn't have it. Like NASA, they convert everything to the metric system. And he wanted to create a national university, which he wanted to catch up with the European countries in terms of higher education. He wanted to have military colleges. Now, if any of those things sound like too much government, just so you know, we do all of those things, and it's generally agreed, well, except the metric system, but it's generally agreed they're all good things. When we get the interstate highway system under Eisenhower, everyone agrees it's a good thing, and it makes the economy better. When we create observatories, the fact that we landed on the moon first was a big deal. When we have higher education, our U.S. economy goes up. So everything he's calling for at the time seemed radical, but we will do all of it, and it all turns out to be good. So he had all these big plans, but during his presidency, he got almost nothing done. And the reason for that is because the most important thing that will happen during his presidency is the rise of the second two-party system. So the first two parties, Federalists and Republicans, those are gone, completely gone. Second two parties that come up are the Democratic Republicans, and that's everyone that supports Andrew Jackson. No one had any idea what they stood for, because they had no platform, no policy. During Adams' years in office, their policy was oppose everything he is for. They didn't have anything they were for. They just were against anything Adams was for. Adams and Henry Clay, they will form the National Republicans. Called themselves national because said they were for the nation as a whole. And they said Republicans because they said they're the heirs to Jefferson and the way the Republicans had been under Madison and Monroe. The Democrats were a much better organized party. John Quincy Adams tried to stay above party, but that was a terrible idea. He was very high-minded, and he said he wasn't willing to make everything about politics. The Democrats, they were, and they were the best organized party in U.S. history to that time. And when I say they just opposed everything that John Quincy Adams was for, I mean, they were ruthless about it. I know it's impossible to imagine a time when one party would just oppose everything of the party in office. But if you can hypothetically imagine back in some distant period when people were that ridiculous, that's what was happening. And it got to be so bad. There's tons of examples, but at one point, John Quincy Adams worked out a deal with some South American countries that was widely accepted to be a good plan. The Democrats in Congress killed it. When asked explicitly, why did you kill it, to someone that in Congress that supported it, he said, because Adams is for it. We'll pass it once we get Jackson in office. So they would oppose literally everything just because it's Adams. So Adams got almost nothing done. There are a couple things to know about John Quincy Adams that kind of give you an idea of his personality and what he was like, and also why he is considered so brilliant. One is, this happened during his presidency. It's called the Treaty of Indian Springs. To make a very long story very short, the people of Georgia wanted Native Americans' lands. So they worked out a deal with the Creek chief William McIntosh to sell all his tribe's land. And McIntosh and several other of the chiefs will do it. But then it turned out they had taken bribes for themselves. They got money for their tribe, but then they had taken huge bribes for themselves to sell out their tribes. So the Creek Indians, they actually killed McIntosh. And then some representatives for the Native Americans, they went up to Washington, D.C., and the Treaty of Indian Springs got to D.C. and was passed by the Senate. The Creek Indians went and said, look, this is fraudulent. It's based on fraud and bribery. John Quincy Adams looked at what happened and said, they're right, this is fraudulent. And so he vetoed the Treaty of Indian Springs and said it had to be renegotiated. He himself sat down with representatives of the Creek Indians and negotiated a new treaty. This is unprecedented. It is one of the only times in U.S. history a president will come down in favor of the Native Americans against Anglo-Americans that want their land. It is one of the only times that's happened, and it's also part of the reason that Adams won't get almost any votes from the state of Georgia. I've heard he didn't get a single one. But all throughout the South, they were furious at him for this. Remember, most Americans didn't consider Native Americans humans. They definitely weren't citizens at the time. They couldn't vote. So that shows you he truly wanted to do what's right and do what was fair to the Native Americans. With in regards to the Native Americans, it's just an unprecedented act by a president in U.S. history. So that's one example of how he was different. Another example, after he becomes president, or after he was president, he will become a leader in the anti-slavery movement. He wasn't an abolitionist. To him, he thought they were too extreme, and what they were calling for would destroy the country. And we'll get to that later. But he will represent the anti-slavery movement more than anyone else in this period. Not the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement. And they are different. We'll talk about that. And there are two examples. One was a case called the Amistad. There was a Spanish slave ship that had come from Africa that was full of slaves and that was traveling to sell the slaves. It was heading to Cuba. There was an uprising on the boat, and the slaves actually managed to overtake the boat and kill the Spanish that were in charge of the boat. They overtook the ship, they came to the United States, and they were arrested. The Spanish said, give us back our slaves. Martin Van Buren was president, and he said, okay, we're going to do that. The slaves, representatives for the slaves sued. And the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. On one side, you have Martin Van Buren administration and the U.S. government. So you have the Department of, the Justice Department. So the U.S. government is saying, we're going to send them back to Cuba and back to the Spanish. On the other side, John Quincy Adams, he said he would represent the slaves. This was a wildly unpopular thing to do, but he argued that they should be free, and to make a really long story short, he actually won. U.S. Supreme Court said, yes, they should get their freedom, so they were not sent back to Cuba, where they would have undoubtedly been executed. So John Quincy Adams argued in favor of freedom, and he actually managed to win the case. And he refused to be paid for it. So that was, for the time, that was a fairly radical thing, but he said it's the right thing to do. Also, after his presidency, he is the only president in U.S. history that will go back to Congress. So after the 4 years being miserable in the White House, then he goes back to Congress and goes into the House of Representatives, where he will stay from 1831 to his death in 1848. He literally dies. He literally dies in Congress. He keeled over, and then they brought him to one of the rooms in the House, and he was there for 2 days, but he will die in Congress serving. And one of the most notable things that he does during this period is he will oppose what's called the gag rule. During Jackson's presidency, Southerners got really upset because we had the rise of abolitionists, people that said we need to get rid of slavery immediately, everywhere. no matter what, regardless of consequences. They need to be ended. And we'll talk about them later, but when that happened, they started sending petitions to Congress. Congress has, there's a rule, Congress has to read petitions. Well, they started sending so many petitions, Congress actually passed what's called a gag rule, saying that they would not discuss anything to do with slavery. Slavery is too controversial, so we will not allow that in Congress. And also under Jackson's presidency, he had the head of the U.S. Postal Service, person in charge of the post office, Postmaster General, start searching the mail going into the South and removing anything that was anti-slavery or abolitionist. That is so wildly unconstitutional for the U.S. Post Office to be searching mail to make sure there's nothing offensive. Anyway, these things, John Quincy Adams was the key person that was against them. He is the leader in the fight against the gag rule, and he just said it's unconstitutional, which there's just no way you can say it's not unconstitutional. It is incredibly unconstitutional. He will lead the fight against this, not just because he was against slavery, he was anti-slavery, but because he said this is unconstitutional against the First Amendment, freedom of speech. So he will take up the anti-slavery torch, but he wasn't so extreme as to be an abolitionist. But Southerners in Congress considered him their primary enemy. And the last thing to know about him, he will say that women should have the right to a political voice in the country. He said it was the right thing to do, so women should have a political voice. Women don't get the right to vote till 1919. So in general, he is way ahead of his time in all these things. That's why he will have such a miserable presidency. He was so incredibly smart that he will have ideas that now seem, normal, but at the time were incredibly fringe. So John Quincy Adams has a miserable 4 years, and based on those things, you kind of get an idea what he was like as a person.